Today's video is sponsored by BetterHelp. I have reviewed a lot of Switch controllers, and one of my personal favorites that I've gone back to and talked to you guys a couple of times is the 8BitDo Pro 2, which is a wireless Bluetooth controller. Well, they have a new version of the controller now that is a dedicated wired design, not for Switch, but for Xbox, that actually has a couple of very interesting differences aside from what system it's designed for. So I want to talk about what exactly sets this one apart and how it fits in the Xbox ecosystem. To begin with, let's just go over real quick what hasn't really changed with this controller. It has the same overall kind of shape and body design and contours as the Pro 2 wireless controller on the Switch. D-pad feels the same, stick placement feels the same, ABXY buttons, shoulders, triggers, all of that is the same. Where we begin to notice some differences though, aside from the obvious Xbox branding, are these buttons in the center here. Obviously, we have an Xbox button that is used for going home, opening up menus, all that good stuff. You have the equivalents of a start and select button on an Xbox controller, which are the menu and view buttons. It has ditched the kind of SNES style start and select buttons that the regular Pro has, and instead is a much more modern design, just small little circular buttons. And beneath those is, of course, the share button that we have on Series X and Series S controllers. Like the Switch version of Pro 2, the Xbox controller does also feature a pair of remappable back buttons that can be modified using the 8BitDo Ultimate software, which we'll talk about a little later. One interesting addition to this controller that is not present on the wireless version of the Pro 2 is an auxiliary port. Makes sense considering the fact the wireless one is designed for the Switch, whose handling of audio through controllers is not great, in fact non-existent, whereas with the Xbox controller, since there has been that previous support for using wired headsets into the controller design, and this is a wired controller, you are able to use a wired headset through it, which is a nice addition. And on that note, of course, one of the big trade-offs this has compared to the wireless one is that it is a wired-only design. It is hardwired in the controller, so you cannot remove this cable if you want to make it a little more portable or you just want to store it a little easier. Though, one thing that is very nice that feels very much in tune with Xbox history is the fact that it does make use of a breakaway cable. So if you're the kind of person who gets a little too angry sometimes during a game, you're more likely to kind of maybe throw this thing around or tug on it a lot. You don't have to worry about accidentally pulling the Series S or Series X off of a shelf. It's going to unplug here instead. One thing that's really funny to me about this being a wired controller, by the way, is the difference in price, and that it's not really that much. The regular wireless Pro 2 controller for Switch, along with PC and other platforms, is $50, whereas this wired-only design is $45. Now, traditionally, you'd think that, losing wireless support in favor of a wired-only design, you'd have a larger fall-off than this, and I suspect the main reason why this is for this controller has to do with licensing. The original 8BitDo Pro 2 controller is not licensed by Nintendo. It's not an officially observed product. It is something that 8BitDo makes, and it is very popular for the Switch, but doesn't actually really have Nintendo's full support. So they're able to get away with charging a lower amount for it, especially compared to officially licensed controllers. The Xbox Pro 2, on the other hand, is Xbox officially licensed. It's got the Xbox logo on the box. I think that's something that does give people a bit of a warm and fuzzy feeling on the inside, and because of that partnership, I suspect that's why the price on this isn't quite as aggressively low. $45 is still a solid price point for what this thing offers, and we'll talk about that a little more in respect to how it goes against other Xbox controllers, but compared to its own wireless version, it's not really that much of a step in terms of savings. Now, I've been using this controller for the past week and comparing it to some of the other options that I really enjoy on the Xbox, and I have some thoughts about where this fits in the overall kind of Xbox ecosystem. Before I get to that though, I do want to take a moment to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. The last couple years have been rough for everyone. There's plenty of reasons to feel stressed out and overwhelmed sometimes. If you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that earlier this year I made a video talking about me experiencing burnout, how it's affected not only my work, but also my personal life, and to be honest, it's still a thing I'm working on, which is why I decided to give BetterHelp a try. After answering a series of questions, BetterHelp was able to assess what my personal needs were and matched me up with a professional licensed therapist who they said I would be able to contact within 48 hours, and in fact, I talked to them the next day over text, and we were able to start scheduling weekly meetings to talk. They have a broad network of over 20,000 licensed therapists that they can match you up with. They can work with you worldwide. And what's really nice about it too is that if for whatever reason you don't like your therapist, if it just doesn't match up, you feel like you need someone else to help you out, it is very easy and free to change over to someone new. BetterHelp is not a crisis line, it is not self-help, it is professional therapy done securely online that is more affordable than doing traditional therapy offline. And there is financial aid available if you need it. If you want to learn more and try the service out for yourself, go to betterhelp.com/Kevin Kenson. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P, not health. And if you use my link, you'll get 10% off your first month. That is also located down below in the description. Something that's really interesting to me about bringing this controller from the Switch over to the Xbox is that the kind of landscape of competition that's out there is very different. For the Switch, there are a lot of controllers out there, both licensed and unlicensed, but in general, they tend to target a very kind of middling price point, oftentimes cheaper than Nintendo's own official option. Usually somewhere around that $50 price point, maybe even lower, especially when it comes to wired designs. On the Xbox though, there's a lot more options out there that are targeting a higher number. There are some licensed ones that are still cheaper, again, because they are wired, but there's also a lot more options out there that are pro level type stuff, offering all kinds of high quality builds, additional functions and features at a considerably higher price point. And based on my own experience and the controllers that I've used, the 8BitDo Pro 2 kind of occupies a very specific space that is unique to it, in that it is something that does offer functions and features that are often associated with a pro-level controller, but at a much more aggressive price point. Normally when you look at third-party controllers for the Xbox that are cheaper than going with the official route, most of them just have the main goal of being an alternative controller. Some of them have their own little unique shticks or special features like, oh, well, it lights up in certain parts, or maybe it has some back buttons or some kind of swappable stick head. But generally speaking, usually the goal is to just be a direct competitor to the official controller at a lower price point. When you start getting into things like remappable back buttons and, programmable features, that's when you start seeing stuff that goes into the higher price range, oftentimes easily breaking the triple digits. Whereas the Pro 2 offers some of those features while still sticking with that $45 price point. Despite being a wired controller, the Xbox version of the Pro 2 does support the ability to connect to a phone using the 8BitDo Ultimate software app, so you can make use of a couple different customizations. One of the very obvious easy ones being the fact that you can swap what different buttons do. You can do this with the regular main buttons on the controller, so if you want the Y button to act as a B button, you can do that. The more traditional use of this, though, is the fact that the two back buttons can be remapped to whatever you want. Usually this is mostly useful for first-person shooters, so you can do things like map the jump button to a back button so you don't have to take your thumb off the sticks. Along with this though, there are a couple other aspects of the controller that can be modified, including the stick sensitivity, trigger sensitivity, and how strong the vibration is in its 4 different locations, each of the handlebars and inside the triggers. One aspect of this that does fall a little short compared to the wireless version of the Pro 2 is that whereas that option offered 3 different profiles you can swap between, the Xbox Pro 2 only gives you the ability to basically toggle on these modifications or toggle them off. While having multiple profiles would be nice, it is at least still handy that you have the option to turn your modifications off and on, because you can do things, for instance, let's say maybe you don't want to be able to use the back buttons for a bit and you're worried you might accidentally tap one. Well, you can turn the profile off to where they do nothing. You can also do things like adjust stick sensitivity so that while the profile is on, the sticks work a little bit differently, and when you want to use traditional sensitivity, you just press a button and turn it back off. Sadly, none of these customizations can be handled directly on your Xbox. You do have to make use of a separate app that is available on both Android and iOS. It is simple and easy enough to use and sync, making use of your phone, and arguably that does have some benefits as well, because you could do things like try to make adjustments mid-match while between loading instead of having to jump out of the game and go to a settings menu, but it still would have been nice to have some official on-system support as an option. Now, as for just my overall experiences of using this controller for a while on the Xbox, it's actually really interesting to me how I almost see the Pro 2 in a little bit of a different light because of the kind of games that I tend to focus on one platform or another. With the Switch, Switch, while I have used this for shooter games in the past, generally on the Switch I am playing a lot more of high-speed action games, RPGs, lots of indie titles, platformers, that kind of thing. Whereas on Xbox, I am more likely to be playing first-person shooters, racing games like Forza Horizon 5, and a little more of the kind of AAA titles that you're used to seeing on PlayStation and Xbox. And because of this different emphasis, I've become a little more acutely aware of the kind of games I don't really like using this controller with more so. And it's not necessarily because the Pro 2 is a bad controller, far from it. It's just the fact that I think there are some games that its particular shape and style fits better than others. And the genres where I really feel like it doesn't perform quite as well are anything that relies very heavily on shoulder buttons, such as racing games and FPS or third-person shooters, which also just happen to be the genres that Xbox has a lot of exclusives of, for instance, Forza Horizon 5 and Halo Infinite right now. And the reason why I don't like this controller as much for these situations isn't that I think the shoulder triggers are bad, it's just that when I'm ultimately comparing using those triggers to using an official first-party Xbox controller, or even some other third-party options out there that try to emulate the shape and style of the Xbox controller, the trigger designs on those just end up being a lot more comfortable. When you look at the shaping of the triggers on the Pro 2 versus an official Xbox controller, you'll notice that with the Pro 2, it does have a little curvature on the top for where your finger rests, but there's still this kind of hard edge right here that's going to dig a little bit into your finger over time. Compared to, say, an official Xbox controller, it has that curvature on the outside so you can wrap around it a lot more comfortably. Again, it's not that this trigger is bad, it's just that if I'm going to be playing a game that makes use of it very heavily for 4 to 6 hours, this is going to end up feeling a little more uncomfortable for me over time compared to that official option. Now, when it comes to playing any other kind of game on the system, whether that's platformers, fighting games, action games, whatever, I end up loving this controller a lot more, and it feels much more at home. The overall shape, styling, and grip is very comfortable. It's amongst my favorite, along with the official Xbox controller. The D-pad on it is fantastic, better than the one on the official Xbox controller, so if you're playing retro games or anything where you want to use the D-pad extensively instead of the left stick, that's a big upgrade. And the tension on the sticks, along with the pushback on the front-facing and shoulder buttons, feels really nice. You know, ultimately, after playing with this controller for the past week, I think my really big takeaway is this is my favorite Xbox controller at its price point. Again, depending on the kind of games you want to play, I think it is worth spending the more money to get an official Xbox controller or some of the Pro options out there, because ultimately, if your main focus is playing Halo or racing games like Forza Horizon 5, I do think those controllers end up fitting the situation better. But if you're looking for an option that just acts as an alternative controller, if there are games you're playing often that don't fall into those categories where shoulder buttons are used a lot, especially indie games, platformers, all that kind of stuff, I really do think this is an excellent auxiliary option to have on hand. Somewhat of a given with a lot of Xbox accessories, this does of course also work with Windows, so if you're playing a lot of those titles on your PC as well, this is a great option. A little bit cheaper too than getting the wireless option, but if you want a dedicated wired connection that's going to be more stable, this is a great pickup for that option as well. Overall, I think this is a solid controller that I don't necessarily give the same overall kind of beaming recommendation that I do to its wireless cousin on the Switch, just due to what other controller options are out there for this platform. But ultimately, if you're looking for a secondary controller to have on your Xbox, you want something that's dedicated wired, and you're not looking to use it primarily for FPS or racing games, this is a fantastic pickup for your Xbox or PC needs. So those are my thoughts on the 8BitDo Pro 2 for the Xbox. If you're interested in grabbing one of these, I do have a link down below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed this video, like it, subscribe if you haven't yet. I want to thank BetterHelp again for sponsoring today's video, and I will see you guys later.